Hello. For our reflection this week, I want to look back to the first resurrection appearances of Jesus 2,000 years ago, since we're still in the season of Easter, and also I think there are things that we can learn from them. Today, let's start by reflecting on the first glimpse of the risen Jesus. This was not to awed crowds or with fanfare and ceremony, but in quiet intimacy with a broken-hearted friend. We find Mary Magdalene at the tomb looking for Jesus. Instead, she's shocked and upset to find his body gone. In its place are two angels. They ask her why she's crying, and she replies by explaining that Jesus is missing. She then turns around and sees Jesus, but in her grief doesn't recognize him. It's only when he speaks to her that the realization dawns just who he is. He then instructs her to go and tell the disciples that she has seen him and spoken with him. Moments before this encounter, though, both Peter and John are at the tomb with Mary. But upon finding it empty, the two men leave and rush home, unlike Mary, who chooses to stay. She instead pauses and makes space and time for her tears. Mary's decision to stay and wait a while in her grief affords her the most remarkable encounter with the risen Jesus, as he interrupts the quiet intimacy of her tears and speaks her name. So, what about us? Do we make space for tears? In the busyness of life, do we allow time for our emotions or the emotions of others? Consumed by her grief, Mary had no idea that she was about to encounter the risen Jesus. Even when he stands before her, her tear-soaked eyes are slow to truly see the one who sees her. Now, the Bible talks often about God seeing us in our grief. Jesus was deeply moved by the pain of two sisters whose brother had died. And in the final book of the Bible, it says that God will wipe away every tear from our eyes with his own hand. In Mary's encounter with Jesus at the tomb, we're reminded that we are seen and known and loved. Let's now briefly reflect on what happens when Mary runs to tell the disciples that Jesus, their executed teacher and friend, is somehow miraculously alive. So, Mary goes to the disciples who were hidden behind locked doors with the news, "I've seen the Lord." And then she tells them all the things that he had said to her. Now, I wonder how the disciples felt when Mary delivered that news that she had seen, spoken to, even hugged the risen Jesus. Did they believe her? Perhaps she was confused. Was it wishful thinking? Or could it really be true? I'm sure that the disciples were each desperately hoping that Jesus was really back, and yet most of them had betrayed Jesus at his very worst moment. As he hung on the cross and looked out at the crowds, they were nowhere to be seen. Their fear drove them to abandon him in his last moments, and now it's their fear that hides them away in a locked room. I wonder what they might have imagined Jesus saying to them if he really was back. Were they maybe thinking he might be angry, disappointed, ashamed of them? When I feel guilt or shame, I'm often tempted to distance myself from God, even to lock the door of my heart in fear of his disappointment. However, Jesus responds to me and to us in the same way he responds to the fearful disciples. In John's Gospel, he tells us that Jesus appears in the midst of them and says, "Peace be with you." And then he shows them his wounds, the visible reminder that he died for them and that he died for us.